Welcome to episode 7 of the Always On podcast series, recorded at the Executive Briefing Center here in Exeter, Rhode Island at Carousel headquarters. I'm your host, Jason Albuquerque, Carousel CIO and CISO. On this episode, we're going to take a deep dive into the challenges organizations face with the management, security, privacy of IoT and connected devices. This is the Always On podcast series where we explore the intersection between technology, security, and business with the industry's best. All right. I'm happy to welcome our guest here, Jeff Horne. He's the Chief Security Officer from Ordr, where he's responsible for security direction within the Ordr product line and internal security. Jeff, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Jason.
No problem. This has been a long time coming. You know, we've had some, we've been talking about this since October. We were talking earlier, I had some COVID scare with the family, and then we had to get through the holidays, but I'm so glad to have you here. Connected devices is definitely a challenge these days.
Sure.
So first off, let's start with, can you introduce Ordr to our listeners and a little bit about your role at Ordr?
Absolutely. So Ordr is a platform that does connected device visibility within the organization. So, and when we say connected devices, we mean all of the devices, like all the Windows systems, Linux systems, and then of course these like IoT systems that are becoming extremely pervasive. And then from a visibility perspective, we're able to do this kind of passively on the network. So we're just simply kind of listening. But being able to capture all of those things, build real-time asset inventory systems, be able to, mature or supplement pre-existing asset management systems down to kind of like the firmware level. So being able to listen to the network, discover devices as they enter the network, and then also monitoring their communications back and forth with one another. And I would say as kind of like the icing on the cake, a lot of the integrations within Ordr exist within all of the switching and networking hardware within an organization. So we're able to kind of lay mitigation controls in the sense of like segmentation policies or segmentation within the network.
No, that's great. I mean, connected devices is such a growing concern these days. We talked about it earlier, how it's such a blind spot. And I mean, we know one of the core principles of security is you can't protect what you don't know about. So visibility is a huge thing, right? So being able to get that level of visibility into all of the devices, all of those connected devices within your network is just a huge, a huge benefit to security teams and IT teams. But also, like you mentioned, that next level of context, right? Because that next level of context is very important. Just not knowing the device exists, but what's that profile of the device? What's the deep dive into that device? So no, that's great. I love the fact that you can give that level of visibility into the device. We talked about the challenges organizations are having. Can we talk a little bit deeper into some of the manufacturer level challenges, maybe some of the operational challenges that you're seeing out there in the field today? I mean, I know just from a manufacturer side, there's lack of standard, there's some resource constraints on some devices you may bring in that may be consumer grade, lack of updates. God, I've seen that within some of my home devices, right? How you buy, let's say, an IP camera for your home, and then all of a sudden they're going on to the next gen and no more updates are available. And it's only been about a year and a half, right?
Right. Yeah, I mean, from a manufacturing perspective, I think the manufacturers themselves have shown that they lack the resources in order to really build secure devices, but then also they kind of lack the incentive to create secure devices because, like you mentioned, they're trying to put out the next camera or put out the the next device. Unfortunately, with these device manufacturers, that they don't have a solid security background. They do things incorrectly, and sometimes these devices, they don't live for a year. Sometimes they live for decades within an organization.
Sure.
And so
that's prevalent in healthcare and manufacturing, right, Jeff? I mean, you see some devices like OT devices that their expected life is decades, right? I mean, that becomes an issue as well. Yeah.
I mean, if you're buying an MRI device for $2.5 million, that MRI device runs, I won't pick on a manufacturer, but they're still coming off the line with Windows XP, Windows 7. And they're transacting images over, SMBv1.
Right.
So
right.
You're not going to be switching out at a healthcare organization, a multi-million-dollar MRI device every year. It's one of those things that's most likely just going to exist and within your network for likely a decade. And securing that device, you have to use some of these fine-tuned controls from a network perspective, because you're not going to install an AV or an EDR agent onto your MRI machine. It's just not going to be supported, even though it's a Windows device.
Right. And especially in some of those medical devices and manufacturing devices, they're sensitive enough where they can't take an agent, right? I mean, I know from a medical device side, they're sensitive to electricity spikes and things of that nature. I mean, they're that sensitive. So,
well, that's why, I mean, really when I joined Ordr, I was like, we have something really special here. And a lot of the IoT device discovery systems that are out there today, they do so by scanning. And I'm not saying a heavyweight, they're not doing vulnerability scans. They're just tapping at the door with simple ICMP ping packets. Yep. And we're finding that healthcare organizations, government, all these OT devices, they'll roll over with just a simple ping scan. I mean, and that's extremely unfortunate. So when I interviewed at Ordr, and I was like, oh my gosh, you're getting all of this passively over the network. They're like, oh yeah, well, we have to do this because there's requirements within United States healthcare in order to do it this way. I was like, well, this extends to manufacturing, any sort of industrial OT device. Because I don't know, I came from a vulnerability assessment and exploit creation background. And I remember one of the first exploits that I wrote was for a pre-existing vulnerability. I was just making it better. And I ended up getting in trouble because my exploit didn't work really well, and we ended up. I'm not going to pick on the cookie manufacturer, but what ended up happening is my exploit was used by our pen test team at Internet Security Systems, and my exploit was used in order to gain access to the system. But with one of these systems, it didn't work. And that system broke, and it didn't come back online. It wasn't resilient.
Right.
That system was responsible for putting fudge on cookies, and it ended up costing the company $250,000 of wasted cookie material because the cookie dropper system, like the fudge dropper system, wasn't applying the fudge to the cookies.
They were manufacturing naked cookies.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's that type of thing, right? And track that to healthcare. You don't want a life-saving device getting knocked over because some Joe scanned it with a ping scanner.
Right. And I mean, the same is true for, like you said, manufacturing, but I also think of critical infrastructure. I mean, think of, all of our utility companies, power companies, things of that nature, uber sensitive devices. I mean, when I was in college, I worked for a utility company for a little while, and, they have all of those IP enabled valve systems and sensors and things of that nature. I mean, the last thing we want to do is, bring down a nuclear power plant or energy companies. Right?
I feel that we as security practitioners, I feel that we have our intuition is that these things need to be isolated, right? Like I don't think there's a CISO on the planet that's sitting there saying, hey, you know what? My TVs and my new coffee maker that plugs in and connects to my Wi-Fi, my security cameras, my MRI machine. That needs to be in the DMZ. That needs to be on the edge of my network so I can get all of the good stuff that's coming in right from allowing all internet communications. Like we kind of intuitively understand that, right? We're like, these devices are risky. They have nothing but horrible vulnerabilities. And it's not like, mind-blowing zero-day vulnerabilities. It's like default passwords that you can't change. Right?
Exactly. So unpatched devices. It's some of that basic stuff.
I'm never going to hang that on the edge. And so one of the things that I tend to talk a lot about with our customers is that you intuitively know you're not going to hang this out to do internet communication. So why are you having it access or be available to the entire network within your organization, particularly if it's like a flat network? So it's like, why is, Jimmy in HR able to access your Avigilon camera controller? It makes no sense.
No reason, right? There's no business case for that.
Exactly. And so at the end of the day, I see these, particularly like IoT or these kind of unmanaged connected devices, not necessarily as a risk in the sense of entry point, because obviously if you're hanging stuff out of the edge, you've got a problem, right? But I see them more as kind of persistent risks, right? Whereas like if you've got a threat actor in your network, it's going to be a lot easier to persist on this, Windows XP MRI machine that has, all of these really vulnerable services that doesn't have, your AV or your CrowdStrike or whatever on it.
Right.
It's going to be a lot easier to exist on that machine than your laptops that have, the entire full security stack.
Oh, absolutely. It exist and stay hidden to a certain degree, right? Because again, remember these devices in many instances are assets that our IT security teams aren't seeing, right? Exactly. They don't have the visibility. So, they can hide in the shadows. And I mean, I even know with some instances with, connected devices we have here, it gives them a nice little Unix platform or Linux platform to work on, right?
For sure. Absolutely. Well, I mean, the thing is like it's really easy to pick on these device manufacturers because, they have not been bludgeoned with the exploit stick that Microsoft has, right? Like Microsoft's just been beaten up for the last, 25, 30 years on, hey, fix it.
Right.
But then again, you have companies like, and this just happened, like Zycel. Right?
Yeah.
They make firewalls.
Right.
They make firewalls that have the firewalls are designed to be on the edge, right? And now they have a default username and password that can't be changed. That's hard coded in the firmware.
Hard coded in. Unbelievable.
Right. Like that's. I know people are putting on their hats and saying, "Oh my gosh, that's there's espionage veins and stuff like that." But I mean, that could just have been a stupid mistake that didn't pass.
That's right.
Your secure development life cycle.
Right. 100%. So from an operational side, what are some other challenges your customers are seeing? I mean, we talked about lack of visibility. I know in some instances with healthcare organizations, I know siloed responsibility and management has become, that's an issue because the IT team and the security team who handles your traditional IT isn't always the OT, IoT team, right? So how do you bridge that gap, right, between hey, I'm a CISO. I want to bring in this tool to give better visibility across the board to both teams. What are some of those operational challenges you're seeing customers have?
I mean, I there's a lot of bridges being gapped, or sorry, a lot of gaps. Let me reverse that. A lot of gaps being bridged. And it's kind of like you mentioned, it's down to that responsibility, right? And I one of the particular challenges that I see is that. I did breach discovery for a number of years, and every organization that told me that they had a beautiful, like the best asset inventory system, I knew was lying to me, right? Because, they might be able to say like, hey, here's Jimmy's laptop in HR and here's all the applications and stuff it has in it. But the second that I go, where is this LG OS TV on your net? Like, where is that in your asset inventory? And how is that connected to your switch? How is it managed? All of that stuff. That's where it really starts to break down. Yep. And it's been years coming, right? These connected devices, is really been a problem from like both an IT security and procurement perspective. Because I can't think of a single boardroom in probably the last 40 years that hasn't had a TV in it. And that TV has matured from a CRT to a plasma to a LCD to now probably an OLED. But during that evolution in technology, it's also become a mini computer. And you're seeing that with
100%.
every washers, coffee makers. And it's just kind of slowly, it's almost like the BYOD problem, right? It's kind of just slowly infected the network.
Right.
And it's bypassed.
I mean, you're coming to me live right now, Jeff, on a probably 80-something inch wallboard in front of me and all this technology in front of me controlling it, right?
For sure. Yeah, it's really weird. Like it's one of those things that it just all of a sudden it clicks for people the second they oh my gosh, I have all of these devices and they are particularly vulnerable. And you mentioned patching. I mean, sometimes it's not the issue. The issue is sometimes not that the patch isn't available. Sometimes whose responsibility is it to patch the LG television?
Exactly.
Right? I mean, are they set for auto update? Did the latest update turn off auto updates? All of these things really need to be answered.
Right. And without an owner, right, there's no responsibility. Without someone accountable for doing it. Is it the IT team, the AV team? Who is it? The operational technology team who needs to manage that, right? So yeah, ownership is huge. But again, I think the foundation of knowing what you have can create that roadmap to designing a responsibility matrix for those assets, right? And I think that's the problem. You have silos of people who know where certain things are because they purchased it and maybe implemented it and put it into action, but who's owning the care and feeding on the day-to-day, right? And there's assumptions happening. Oh, IT's just going to get that.
Well, one of the gaps that I definitely see that needs to be bridged and bridged quickly is that because you can't put an agent on a lot of these devices, if not all, like most IoT devices can't take an agent in order to secure them or gain insight into them. The segmentation policies within the network are typically by IT operations. But it's starting to become more and more of a necessary mitigating control from a security perspective. So one of the things that I when working with our customers that have, hey, we have the Ordr appliance or we have the Ordr product in our environment. We see everything, right? We have built a real-time asset inventory system with this product. But we also have this ability to create subnets or create VLANs and all of these different little micro segmentation controls in there. That's typically owned by the IT operations team.
Right.
But in the hands of the the security operations team, it could be particularly dangerous, right? IT, from a philosophical perspective, their job is to make sure that the packets flow, right? And then from a security perspective, we're trying to make sure that certain packets don't flow, right? And IT operations eyes get really big the second that you say, "Oh my gosh, my security team is going to have microsegmentation control."
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And I mean, I think that's the beauty of what I'm starting to see within IT and security organizations is that a lot of security teams are now starting to get that seat at the table where resilience is part of their job as well. Right.
For sure.
Making sure the business can still run while being secure. And that's why I have a lot of conversations around resilience in an organization, right, with customers. And, you want to be secure, but you also need to make sure your business is running. And that's why you need to have a seat at the table with all of these executives. That's why you need to have a seat at the table with the strategy for the organization. That way you're getting that proactive knowledge of what's happening and what you need to do, right? Because, again, we may not be able to take the same path to secure it, but we can realize and figure out mitigating controls, right, to be able to still let the business run.
Right.
And that's part of our job.
Of Jimmy in HR, right? Obviously, that person should not be accessing the Avigilon security camera controller, right? So, from a visibility perspective, it's really important to have that device visibility and down to like the serial number and firmware level, but also that communication visibility. Because, in order to build a kind of a segmented zone, you need to understand how to make sure that that's going to be resilient and operate as needed, right? Because obviously you don't have a camera orphaned from the Avigilon controller, or I keep picking on Avigilon, but a camera orphaned from the from the camera controller. Right. And so being able to see all of those flows and those network transactions, you're able to make a informed segmentation policy to say, hey, look, I'm going to create this sphere, and we're not necessarily talking air gapped. I mean, obviously people with a certain authorization can access it, but this starts trampling on security overtly in the sense that you've got these micro-segmented spheres that these things need to operate within. It's a lot easier to do behavioral detection for anomalies once you've kind of isolated 1,000 devices into, let's say, 20 zones.
Sure. And it allows you to profile those assets, right?
Absolutely.
At that point, you have that level of context where you can profile the asset and say, here's the normal behavior of what this asset should be doing. And now you can trigger that anomalous behavior and get an event out of it, right?
Absolutely.
And say, hey, wait a minute, this isn't acting normal. Go take a look at it. Stat, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, no, that's great.
Feel like people's mind gets blown the second that they see, like, oh, well, I think that this device works in this certain way, right? And then they take a look at all of the flows or all of the transactions. You're like, oh my gosh, what is my?
I can't believe it's generating this much traffic. What the hell's it doing? So now, from an operational side, how has the move to that like service edge kind of played a role in IoT and OT security? Because I'm starting to see a lot about the edge layer, and now people talking about the fog layer, right, where it's actually communicating up to the cloud. You know, how is that played from an I see operational challenges all over that, right? But I mean, what are you seeing out there? Because these are new conversations around IoT and OT.
For sure. I see the same I see the same problems from trying to lock them down to a service, similar to like the same problem that we see with security, right? Because a lot of these devices, unfortunately, need a lot of these different services. And you kind of see it through just the protocol transactions that they do. Just to pick on Zycel again, those devices had FTP running and SSH running, and that's kind of normal for a firewall. But, at the end of the day, you look at these televisions, and I'm not going to pick on a television manufacturer, but, they're running a web server, they're running FTP, they're running, they're connecting and moving things, throughout the network because they are truly mini computers with browsers on them now that people can go surf to whatever they want. Right. And so that's, really difficult when you kind of do this kind of quasi, like, let's say zero trust in the sense of what services do I want this thing to transact? And you might say that, hey, there should be no reason why my television runs an FTP server. Let me block that, that. And let me only let it communicate with, Samsung servers in AWS and within a certain zone. Yeah. That starts really breaking down the second that you don't fully understand that device, right? Blocking FTP might block the ability for it to take updates properly.
Sure,
and that's getting into that resiliency problem because we don't really understand these devices. We don't understand what are the necessary services versus what are the kind of UP&P. Let's have these extensible services, that aren't necessarily necessary.
Right. Or even best practice when it comes to architecture, right? Because again, some of that information I've been reading about that whole fog service layer is maybe you can have a centralized controller that they all point to, and then that centralized controller can do the communication to the cloud and the transaction of data and things of that nature. So understanding the asset, understanding the needs, and then understanding the proper architecture to put it in.
Right. Well, that also comes into like where security is starting to get really into the resiliency problem because I would say that works in practice, right? On paper, it's like, hey, why don't I just have a server that goes in and I talk to it internally, and then that thing brokers the connection to the cloud and distribute it. So that makes total sense in terms of like, let's say that you're a Windows shop and you've got SCCM, right? So it's like, hey, let me go pull down my patches from Microsoft once and then use this server to deploy them internally. Right. But there needs to be resiliency in that just to have failovers just in case that server doesn't exist. And I will say a recent issue that I was personally involved in is that we had an organization that didn't allow call-outs to time servers. So like time.gov or, time.microsoft.com. And they were using an internal broker server to basically say, hey, I'm gonna have my internal time server. I'm gonna go reach out and distribute it. But they only had one. And it failed, right? And so now everything can't, get the. It was. I mean, obviously not a disaster, but it kind of for these devices that need a very accurate time, you run the risk of damaging kind of like that resiliency in terms of either believing the accuracy of a device or having that device operate as.
No, that makes sense. So from out there in the industry and out there within your client base, what are the risks you're seeing the most, right? Because a lot of things I'm seeing is the malware conversation, the DDoS conversation, the crypto miners getting installed, things of that nature. I mean, we talked a little bit on the beginning about being able to use a device to maybe pivot off of, right? So what are you seeing trends from these malactors leveraging these OT and IoT devices? And again, I'm just trying to get, our listeners to know, here's the risks that we're seeing real time, like actually happening out there in the industry.
Yeah, this is something that, I will say, just to answer your question, ransomware is a service. Like we have a large number of our customers are healthcare organizations, and they were, as you probably read, pretty targeted over the last 2 years with ransomware as a service. But one of the things that I feel is either misconstrued or misunderstood is that these threat actors aren't really going after IoT devices. They're not coming into an organization and saying, let me go pivot to that MRI machine, right?
Right. I'm going to watch your camera for a little bit.
Yeah, let me watch your camera for a little bit.
Right.
Maybe in some cases they're doing that, but particularly with the ransomware as a service, they want to get in. They want to be as they want to be distribute as efficiently as possible. And one of the things is that look at it from a pen test perspective, or obviously like a hacker perspective. As long as it's got an IP and it's vulnerable, I don't care what it is. Right. And so if I'm sitting there in a network and it's got Windows 10 all over the place and it's been fully updated and I've got, CrowdStrike and, name the 1,000 other tools that are distributed on the workstations. But then I've got this $2 million MRI device that's running Windows XP SP0, no service pack, hasn't been updated in ages, run SMB v1. I'm like, I'm going to go after the low hanging fruit here. And the thing is that they might even not know what that system is. And, I'm picking on Windows, but, you've got extremely vulnerable, full-fledged like Linux operating systems that exist. Or, hey, this thing runs a web server that was distributed, 4 or 5 years ago and hasn't been updated because it's a device that doesn't regularly get updates, or it's not managed by the IT, team appropriately. But at the end of the day, from a hacker perspective, they're going after the low-hanging fruit. And unfortunately, the low-hanging fruit are these, these really dumb devices that they can't install security products on, and that have either vulnerable services that have been vulnerable for 10 years in some cases, right? That I could literally walk my sister through exploiting with like Metasploit, or they've got default passwords just all over the place because they're not being managed properly.
Right. Yeah. No, that makes sense. It's the path of least resistance, right? And ultimately it's a means to an end for the end game, whatever end game they're looking for. Right? Whatever that end game may be, they're just using that as a jump point or a way to stay in the shadows, like we talked about earlier, right?
For sure. I mean, if you're going to get, I worked a breach back in, this was probably 2007, and it was a radio station, and the radio station had configure. Right. It was like one of these things that was like, okay, it's just all over the place. But their system that ended up being the point that just kept reinfecting the whole network. They brought systems down, cleaned it, brought them back up. Oh my God, there's a system has it on there and it's reinfecting it. And ended up being a soundboard. And that soundboard ran Windows. It was a Windows system, and it was just like a little rack-mounted thing. And I was sitting there, I was talking to the DJs, and they're like, "Oh yeah, this plays our fart noises and stuff that we play on the radio." I'm like, yeah, and there was no way, there was no head unit, there was no way for me to really like gain access to it.
Right.
And so, that's the real problem, right? If you've got something that is in your network, it's pervasively, sending out and infecting your network, but you can't connect to it. You can't gain access to it. You can't remediate it. Sometimes the only thing you can do is either isolate it or pull it out of the network.
Unplug it, right?
Incredibly damaging, right? Like in that case, the DJ wasn't able to play his fart noises on the radio, but take that up a notch and be like, oh my God, we're a cookie manufacturer, and now our cookie machine isn't printing out, the fudge on the fudge cookies.
Right. And in the meantime, that radio station, I mean, for the security folks, it must have been like Groundhog Day, right? You clean everything up and all of a sudden everything's reinfected. And you clean everything up and all of a sudden everything's reinfected. And sorry, DJ, but no farts today.
For sure. Well, in that case, I wish they had a security team, because I was just like the man of one sitting there screaming into the darkness. They're like, guys, you can't bring these machines back up.
Right. So now, one of the biggest risks I see just through this conversation, again, is that lack of awareness, that lack of visibility, that lack of oversight into these connected devices. But more and more, I'm starting to see the connectivity of these devices to other systems, transferring data, right? Looking, basically the business asking for API connections to these devices so they can transfer data. I mean, we live in a world that data is 100% monetized, man. I mean, that's it. That's where we are today, right? And it's extremely dangerous if it's not implemented correctly and your security team doesn't have that insight. What are some of the privacy issues that you've seen, right? I mean, I know some devices collect some personal information. I know some devices, obviously like medical devices are, they have PHI on them. Do you see any of these malactors going after that type of information, or is it strictly that means to an end, right? Because again, there's privacy concerns and privacy challenges that, pop in my head right away.
Yeah, I can't think of an instance where, a lot of these threat actors within the last several years, they're just wanting to make money, right? And so the biggest thing that I've really seen is, these kind of semi-blackmail campaigns by trying to take pre-existing passwords, from a privacy perspective. But, from a these devices becoming more smart, these devices becoming integrated into our lives, my wife, she has an iWatch, right? And it monitors her heart, her biometric data, all of these things.
Jeff, I mean, honestly, my example, Jeff, was going to be this, right? I mean, it's my new Android watch that I have.
Sure.
I set it up and it's like, all right, we want to take your pulse. We want to take your blood ox. We want to take this. We want to know your fit. I mean, all of these questions I'm answering and I'm going privacy red flag all day long. Right. Well, and that's kind of what spawned a lot of this.
one of the things I being involved in vulnerability exploit and pen testing, one of the things that I typically look at is you've got these devices, right? And they have default passwords. They have these kind of really low-hanging fruit vulnerabilities that, we kind of solved from an operating system perspective 30 years ago, right? Like, don't put default passwords that you can't have your user change. And
we know the best practices. Many organizations aren't putting those foundational practices into place, so we're still getting nailed. But at least we know.
but for instance, like I don't know which watch you're wearing, but for some of the watches that I've looked at, they can communicate obviously to Wi-Fi, right? And so if you've got these devices, like you've got organizations that say, hey, your insurance will get lower if you wear one of these devices and work out. We're going to have these challenges as an organization. Type of thing.
Yep.
But if you look at kind of like the authentication protocols, right? Okay, you've got, let's say that you're a high security environment and you've got WPA2 enterprise and you're doing PEEP TLS, but unfortunately you're doing MS CHAP within that PEEP frame, right?
Yep.
So somebody could just set up a rogue access point with the same name as your access point, right?
Yep.
And then all
100%.
of a sudden, you've got, your Windows system, your Ubuntu, 2004, your Mac OS for sure. The second that rogue AP is discovered and it tries to do that radius authentication, right, it's going to scream at you that they're like, hey, something's weird with this certificate, right? Like, unless they're really good, they're going to scream about their certificate.
Yep.
That watch probably won't. It'll just connect.
Exactly.
And then you've got NTLM hashes for days coming off of these devices. So, it's kind of funny to me from like a physical security perspective to see a facility that has like locks on the doors, all these things, but then like Wi-Fi cameras that you literally just need to bring a rogue access point into their environment to just grab all of the service accounts that are tied to these stupid devices.
Drop a pineapple in there and you're good.
Exactly. So it's one of those things that like we're maturing the devices, but man, we've got a lot of ground to keep up because we've got 30-year vulnerabilities in there. Like we're talking about now, like we need to have certificate revocation, certificate verification on these these watches and stuff. But that also, like, just a long-winded answer, that has privacy concerns because obviously you've got networks, particularly enterprise networks, that they're figuring out what's on the SSL, right? They're decrypting SSL, and that has that has an inherent privacy risk associated with it. Or I think of all of these devices that we're wearing that are transacting information. If that data ever got out, it could be particularly damning to somebody. Obviously, like the joke, like, if I die, delete my browser history. Now it extends to my watch and all this other stuff, right?
Yep. Yet another blackmail campaign that they could go after.
Well, I mean, like, think about it from a watch perspective. These things typically have Wi-Fi capabilities, usually GPS capabilities. And I was speaking to a engineer for not necessarily one of the watch companies, but one of the fitness band companies.
Yep.
And one of the things that I didn't realize this, but one of the things these devices are really good at now are detecting what you're doing. So if you're on a row machine, if you're cycling, if you're doing sit-ups, push-ups, or whatever, they have gyroscopic accelerometer.
Yeah. And they can actually identify the motion. Wow.
Absolutely. Because they want to be smart, right? They want to say, hey,
sure.
You want to log that on your watch. The problem is that people are wearing them for also sexual activity. And so they're trying to figure out we have all of this data, right? And we can tell what they're doing, but obviously we don't want to share that because there's an inherent privacy concern there. And we don't want to feel like we're being too invasive into your life, but also too, if you find out that somebody's having, a sexual encounter and their GPS is not at home, there's some serious privacy. Those are some things that are, we have these organizations that have this data. They're munching on the data with ML in order to make their products better, but there's inherent privacy concerns. And I think that one of the best things that's happening in cybersecurity right now is all of the thought that's being put into data protection, data privacy, and then the elimination of unneeded data that bring inherent privacy issues. So
the golden nugget out of this conversation is that night, take your watch and put it on the dog's collar.
Or maybe not, right? We're picking up some strange activity. Although that would be a really good, that would be a very good adversarial AI if all of a sudden everybody started putting it on their dogs.
Right.
And we just messed up all of the
We'll
ML.
just social engineer those watch companies.
For sure.
I love it. So for organizations who realize that visibility into their IoT and connected devices, they realize it's an issue, right? They realize it's a gap. They realize it's a blind spot. What are some best practices, golden nuggets, some places where these folks can start to kind of get on that journey, right? Because again, it's not going to be an instant type solution. It's going to be a journey to start gathering this information, have the right conversations with business stakeholders. I know from a manufacturer side, there's going to be challenges, but I think there's a few, there's a certification body, I think that just came up, PSA. I think they're starting to look at certifications. There's IOXT Alliance kind of keeping an eye on IoT devices to make sure they're standards. So I see some progress there. I'm not sure how successful they've been. But what are just some golden nuggets that, the listeners can take away to start this journey into really shining a light onto these blind spots?
It's going to be really down to discovery. First and foremost, like you mentioned at the start of the podcast, is you cannot protect what you can't see, and you can't obviously manage what you don't know about, right? And so that kind of brings in that IT and security, security bucket. But first and foremost, being able to discover these devices, however they need to do it. I mean, Ordr does offer a program where and every time that we put a device within kind of a proof of value deployment, we're seeing probably 30%. Organizations don't know about 30% of the devices that are transacting on the network on a day-to-day basis. And it really, comes down to maybe even mature organizations where, let's say that they've got a vulnerability scanner, right? They've got, one of these really good vulnerability scanners. You're a CISO, what time do these vulnerability scanners typically run? It's usually 2 a.m., right? On
when nobody's on the network.
Right? Whereas hey, on Saturday night at 2 a.m., this thing's going to run, right? Okay. And then that feeds an asset inventory and you're sitting there what's that Android device right there? But the problem is that a lot of organizations aren't running that continually. Maybe that's only updated once a month if you're lucky. And then, at the end of the day, you're not getting a really good feel of what's on your network at 9 a.m. on that Monday morning, right? So that visibility is one of those things where we open people's eyes through a discovery platform.
Live visibility at that, right? Real time.
Yeah, the second somebody brings in, that unpatched Android device and it's just hanging off of the guest network, a lot of we do a lot of healthcare and in certain healthcare organizations, you're actually not allowed to have things like Amazon Alexas, mainly because they pose a HIPAA risk because you're just one Alexa away from exposing potential patient information.
Sure. Yep. Makes total sense.
But we've seen them being used in like the wellness centers, right? The relaxation areas to play music and stuff.
And things, yeah, right.
That information. We see a lot of Teslas. So a lot of times the hospital staff they're getting Teslas and they're bringing their EV cars and plugging it into the EV spot and then connecting it to the corporate Wi-Fi because that's the fast Wi-Fi.
Yeah, right. Well, I never
so now you
thought
got
of
these things hanging off your network that are just eating up your bandwidth. And it's one of those things that being able to find those devices, discover them is kind of the first step. And then I would say the second step is monitoring how they're communicating, right? Yep. Figuring out how they communicate within the network, not necessarily from a risk perspective, but just an additional data point. So when you start talking about mitigating your risk, that a sensible segmentation policy can be discussed, where it's like, hey, look, we've got these group of devices, and let me pick on TVs for a second. Like we've got 40 TVs within the organization. They don't need to be able to transact across broadcast across these subnets. Let's isolate them and make sure that, if they're LG, Samsung, whatever, that they can reach out to the servers that they need for updates. Let's make sure that they're updated. And then also let's make sure that they can't, be a pivot point or a persistence point rather inside of the network.
Yeah. And that's really where Ordr comes into play, right? You really solve those foundational needs in order to continue down that journey, right? I mean, there's foundational items that you have to have, right? The visibility to the device and the context around the device. So you really, that's where you're solving this issue. You're bringing that context and that visibility to organizations. So I think you're helping solve a lot of those challenges by offering out those necessary items that security teams need and IT teams need to have that to be able to secure them. I mean, you really can't secure them without knowing what they're doing, right? And knowing that they're there.
Importantly, we're doing it passively, right? Because I think one of the arguments that you can always hit somebody over the head with is that I don't want to run that scan because it's going to knock over the system, right?
Yep.
And so we see, trying to doing it this way passively kind of overcomes that argument or overcomes that barrier in terms of how do I create a real-time asset inventory system that doesn't have the fear of knocking over an OT device or a medical device.
That's right. And you're absolutely right. So many times you have conversations with IT leaders or security leaders, and they love the technology. They love what it brings to the table. But the first question is it going to bring down my servers? Is it going to bring down my systems? Doesn't have an agent that's going to affect performance? Those are the types of questions that they ask. And as soon as you say yes to any of them, they're like, nope, time out, I'm done. Especially in Uber sensitive type environments like medical, right? Utility, those type of organizations. So yeah, no, I get it. I love it. I mean, the technology that you bring to the table is definitely solving a problem, a huge problem that we're having. Any tidbits from customer success stories, right? Any client use cases? I love to be able to shine a light on some challenges that maybe some of your customers had and how Ordr came to the table and solved that.
Yep. So I have one really that sticks in my mind that was recent. And so we had an organization that was dealing with one of those ransomware as a service. And apart from, obviously monitoring, we monitor more than flows. So we are at a packet level. So we have a deep packet inspection, essentially an IDS that monitors east-west traffic. So we're able to discover things like Eternal Blue hitting an SMBV1 machine. So, apart from just the typical, call outs to C2 servers or, specific, hey, these are, this is specifically the ransomware, detection signature, we were seeing lateral movement, or rather the customer was seeing lateral movement within the organization. So a lot of times these ransomware as a service, they're not an autonomous piece of malware. They're threat actors within the network that are pivoting box to box, trying to be as pervasive as possible. So they recognized that, but they were also extremely mature. And so what they were able to do is they were able to essentially build a constellation diagram of here is a device that went out to at the time, it wasn't a known C2 server, but it was able to go out to a known distribution point. It ended up being compromised. And then we saw it pivot through the network. And so utilizing the tool, the customer was able to take that server and all of the subsequent machines that it had connected to within a certain time period and isolate them within a segregated VLAN that could only connect to SCCM and CrowdStrike servers. So it was essentially a more nuanced approach than going in and saying, obviously, like with our integrations with switches, you can go in and turn off the ports and things like that. And sometimes that's absolutely an option because, you've got something that's just being, bad on the network. But utilizing that kind of nuanced approach to swing those devices in a different way using a segmentation policy and then being able to put them in kind of like that remediation realm. That was a real big success story for us in the sense that they utilized that functionality in kind of an emergency response capability.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, right? I mean, basically, they were able to pivot into a sandbox in an IR situation, right? Literally sandbox all of that. And I love it. Build a constellation map, know exactly what's going on, boom, isolate it, sandbox it all. Now you can start looking into that traffic and looking into that malactor and really do a deep dive investigation on that, right?
Right. And I mean, building rules at that point and being able to say, let's even say that they didn't want to segment it with VLAN segmentation, or they wanted they did it with a subnet or something. You could then say, well, these systems don't get to talk to my domain controller now. We know from a lateral mover perspective that that's the keys to the castle. Let's make sure that they can't talk to the DCs. That is something that is I think relies on the maturity of the organization, relies on obviously the talent from a security perspective, but micro-segmentation controls are a really good mitigating control, but in this particular case, it was an emergency incident response control. Right. And it was deployed properly.
No, that's outstanding. Well, Jeff, thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you to Ordr for having you on today. For more thought leadership content like this, for Always On virtual series, for our webinars, our pizza casts, and future episodes of the podcast, you can visit us at carouselindustries.com/events. Thank you for joining us, and thanks again, Jeff, for joining us.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you having me.